Welcome to the PolyPsych podcast. This is your host, Anthony Lindsay. I'm here with Tatum, Ellis. First question is, there's a sharp division between liberals and conservatives. In general, what accounts for this ideological split?
Well, there's a couple speculations. So essentially the article that I'm looking to discuss today was focused on those ideological differences. So essentially, liberals tend to pull more from two major ideological bases, with the avoiding harm and fairness, whereas conservatives tend to pull more evenly from all five moral foundations groups. So as in addition to the ones that liberals pull from, they're also taking into account in-group loyalty, deference to authority, and purity factors. So the article kind of closes with speculating as to why this might be, and the authors identify that as a point for future research, whether that is kind of a cause or effect of conservatism or liberalism. So essentially they're saying that they aren't sure whether these differences can be accounted for as a basis for choosing ideological preferences, or whether they are a result of those ideological preferences.
Huh. So there was a book called The Republican Brain, and it was by Chris Mooney, and he touched on some of the same principles. And the idea was that Republicans, they have an in-group loyalty, and they have more respect for authority, more respect for the symbolic representations of the country, versus liberals who have these underlying principles that are radically different. So it's like they'll have a greater sense of do no harm, protect those without power, that kind of thing. So it's like when the two sides argue, they're coming at it from two completely different perspectives, and it's almost like they're talking past each other because they're appealing to the things that would appeal to them. It's like, how could you kneel for the flag? That kind of thing.
That's a great example of kind of the differences and what basis they're drawing from. Because to liberals, kneeling for the national anthem would be a great example of standing up for fairness, and kind of like the outgroup who is being shown or who is being harmed by divisive government policies, whereas to conservatives, kneeling for the flag is like a kind of spitting in the face of their other moral foundations that are far more important to them than liberals. So kind of, by kneeling for the flag, liberals are flying in the face of authoritarianism and, in-group loyalty. That's a really good example of them, a big controversy in the political realm right now, where, conservatives and liberals are making arguments that make perfect sense to them, but to the other group, because of the differences in priorities, it doesn't align.
Yeah, I wonder if it's intrinsic, this ideological split, and is just now trickled to the surface, or if the political climate is made for the political split to be more salient. I wonder if and that's kind of an interesting topic, because it does beg the question, like, okay, is increased deference to authority and loyalty to in-group, is that part of conservatism that the followers adopt, or is that something that attracts them to conservatism in the first place? Yeah. So do you think there's a way to reverse this the moral foundations that is within liberalism or conservatism? Do you think there's a way to reverse the moral foundation that they have already established?
I think an interesting way to measure that would, whether, again, what we were just talking about, whether it's a cause or effect of being attracted to, liberalism or conservatism, be tough to measure, because so many, by the time that they're doing these studies, people already have a set ideological foundation. The only way I can think of to determine it would be to conduct the studies on people who, like a younger generation or a younger, sample size, a sample population who maybe don't have those ideological preferences formed yet, to determine, as a baseline, which ones they're, intrinsically more inclined to favor, which of the moral foundations they're intrinsically more inclined to favor, and then, measuring that at a later date after they've formed their ideological preferences to see whether those moral foundation preferences hold constant. So kind of research, suggests that, that is the cause of choosing a political party or political ideology, or whether, the moral foundations change after the study group chooses or aligns with a particular political ideology, which would suggest that it's an effect.
So we probably have to do like a time trial and have like the person, like follow a person through like several years to figure out where their ideology lies and why that happened.
Definitely, yeah, because you'd have to do it on such a young population that they've had virtually no, exposure or thought put towards political ideology, and then measure it at a later date after they've been able to form political preferences.
Mm-hmm. So how much of a factor do you think is genetics or environment? I know we're speculating beyond the scope of the article, but like, do you think genetics are more of a factor or the environment? Because I heard of a study, a twin study, where they separated them, but both twins were under parents that were conservative. They had a genetic predisposition to being conservative, and they were split up, and one of them ended up under parents who were very liberal, but they were still conservative. And it turns out that if you are genetically predisposed to being conservative, you are like 8 times more likely to be conservative, no matter what your environment is. Which begs the question: do you think this is genetic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that makes sense because genes definitely. I don't believe that there's probably a particular gene that makes you conservative or liberal, but genes do have an effect on personality outcomes. So we know from previous studies that conservatives tend to be more emotionally sensitive to or social order, or in group loyalties. They have higher thresholds of disgust, which contributes to distrust of outgroups, whereas liberals tend to be more open to new experiences and kind of more naturally empathetic. So personality traits do affect whether someone is inclined to be conservative or liberal, and at the base of those differences in personality is genetic differences. So I think it's probably a combination of both. But like you said, I think that the biological basis for political preferences really can't be discounted. Because like you said, there's a plethora of studies done on twins that show that there is some sort of biological happening, because time and time again it's been shown that it's been suggested that there is of factors influencing political ideology outside of just the environment that an individual grows up in.
I wonder if you could I wish you could experiment with them and let's change every room that they walk into to blue and see if that changes their political ideology. I feel like there should be more research dumped into it, because especially for politicians and lobbying firms and think tanks. Just imagine if you could change a person's ideology by doing something simple, like don't let them see political commercials, and they're 4 times more likely to become liberal. That'd be huge. Yeah,
definitely. If there was any sort of opportunity, or if there was a situation where you'd be devoid of any moral obligation to the participant, it would be so interesting to be able to, kind of raise the subject within a political bubble, to see influence, because that's really the only way I think you'd be able to exactly determine how much influence biology really has. Because if you're bringing them up in a situation where there's that's completely devoid of any influences, then you would really be able to have an outcome that you could truly say is biological preferences at work, because they didn't have that environmental stimulus that would influence their outcome.
Gosh, in America is probably the furthest thing from that environment. The idea that you didn't hear any political discussion, and you were politically isolated is borderline impossible at this point, especially with the 24-hour news cycle. Do you think that exacerbated the issue, by the way, the constant barrage of political messaging?
Yeah, I definitely think it did. Because again, going back to the biological basis, and in one of my classes we're in right now, we've been learning a lot about liberals tend to react more to news and political advertising that draws upon anger, and injustice, unfairness to outgroups, drawing on those empathetic tendencies, whereas conservatives tend to be more subject to plays upon anxiety. So that's where the whole immigration threats, unemployment, stuff like that tends to appeal more to conservatives. So I think the 24 news cycle really increases that issue, because both liberals and conservatives constantly have access and are constantly being fed news stories, political advertisements that kind of whether deliberately or indeliberately, prey upon those natural tendencies, which kind of draws them to be more increasingly partisan.
So I wonder if you were running for office, let's say you're running for president, all right, and you have to galvanize both sides, both conservatives and liberals. Like, what appeals to both sides? Like, what message would you put out to get both of them on your side?
Oh, geez. Well, I think if I knew that answer, I should just run for president right now, because you really could get both parties mobilized like that. That would be really great. Mm-hmm. I think the best strategy would just be kind of having a balance of both the issues. And I don't know, it really would be tough because above all other factors, above any biological factor or, environmental thing, partisanship is still the greatest single indicator of how someone votes. So I think you really have to try to focus between balancing between a liberal and conservative partisan platform. Difficult because, obviously so many issues are so divisive, but I really think you would have to balance between humanizing both sides and keeping a measure between what messages you're putting out to make sure that both groups feel like they have equal stake within a party platform or a candidate's platform.
All right. So this is the PolyPsych podcast for today. This is your host, Anthony Lindsay. Go to polypsych.org where you can submit your name and your email, and then we can talk about any research you have, any research that appeals to you, a book that appeals to you. If you have a project coming up, we would definitely like to talk about it. Again, go to polypsych.org where you can sign up. This was Anthony Lindsay with Tatum Ellis. Bye.